Hello, folks. I'm Brett Kinsella of VoiceBot AI and Synthedia, and we're here for GAIN, the Generative AI News Rundown. And this is where we've been gathering for the last 14 weeks now, every week, talking about the top generative AI news of the week. Allen Firstenberg is my special guest today. Allen, how are you?
I am great, Brett. I am tired, but I am doing well. Thank you.
Why would you be tired, Allen?
It's been, a busy day and a busy week and a busy week leading up to this one because of Google I/O.
Google I/O. And this has a little bit to do with your background too, because you've been a longtime Google development expert across a number of technologies and really tied into the Google ecosystem.
Yeah, I've been a GDE now for 10 years, and that means, that I don't work for Google, but I do work closely with them. So, I help them out, help them understand what developers need, and help developers understand, what the latest Google technologies are all about and how we can use them.
All right, great. And we're going to talk a little bit about Google today. That might be one of the reasons why you were invited specifically for today. Big news from Google I/O, but there's just so much news around generative AI and Google. It's just good for us to be able to spend a significant amount of time on that. But that's not all. We're going to talk about some things with Bing Chat, with OpenAI, with deepfakes. Boy, this recurring theme, deepfakes just keep coming up more and more. And we're going to talk specifically about a project that someone in the voice AI community did around recreating a website using generative AI. Did it in 2 days with $53 and a pretty substantial website. And some of you guys have seen that video. If you haven't, we'll give you sort of the rundown. We can talk about that briefly. Okay, so we should get right into this, but I should tell the people in the audience, if you're on YouTube Live or if you're on LinkedIn watching this live, let us know you're here. Put a comment in, just say hi so we know you're there. And feel free to comment, ask questions, whatever it might be, particularly with Allen here. Ask questions. He's very good at answering questions. He's basically an LLM. And that's actually one of my new theories, that humans are large language models. But that's a whole nother story. But definitely ask your questions. Let us know you're here. We'll try to incorporate it into the show today. All right, without further ado, I think what we should do is talk about Bard. I just want to talk about Bard first because it's been so central. There's so many things that we're going to talk about in terms of Google I/O, but we saw Bard yesterday, and I've had access for since March, I think it was early March. I don't know about you, Allen. You've used it quite a bit over the last 3 months too, correct?
I feel like I have, certainly I've done things like compare it to OpenAI, uh, and just play around with it. And yeah, I guess since about March as well. I can't remember exactly when.
Yeah. Okay. So uh, I've played with it. I don't use it on a regular basis, mostly because it's not quite there yet. But we can talk about a few different things. What I want to do is just walk through. We did this like really handy thing about these 20 takeaways, and we'll talk through a few of these as we go through. So the first is no more waitlist. That's a pretty great thing because it's been in a closed preview. A few of us have had access, but now everybody can, and I definitely recommend you give it a shot. And it's now available in 180 countries. Notably, none of those countries it's available in are in the EU. Did that surprise you, Allen?
It did actually, to a degree. It wasn't until later that I heard that about that particular restriction. We've got an item coming up that it's going to be available in more languages, and I heard from people in the EU saying, "Hey, it's great. They're actually going to be supporting my language." But I don't, so that confused me from here. I have heard speculation since that both the EU and Canada, which is also
Yeah,
not
I
going to
saw that.
be in the allowed list initially, um, have restrictions on personal information export. So it sounds to me like there's some concern there about, hey, where is this computation taking place? It is taking place in our borders. Can we get an agreement about it? So I think Google is just playing overly cautious on that one.
Well, yeah, and there could be a few things too. I don't actually know, and maybe you have some insight in this, where Bard is hosted in the Google Cloud ecosystem. I know that you would think it's distributed. They certainly have these capabilities for Europe. There's a lot of rules about data from European citizens staying in European data centers. But we also know that Google, even though it's distributed all over the world in terms of its cloud capabilities, things like Dialogflow run from the US only. And then it's distributed elsewhere. So it's actually, or excuse me, it's accessed from everywhere into like a US central hub. So it could be that Bard actually is not hosted in the EU, so it can't do that, but that wouldn't explain Canada. So I think there's another reason here.
Well, again, I think Canada has similar user information export laws. I don't know where Bard runs completely, to be honest. Although I believe that at least part of Google's AI team is in Switzerland. They've got members of the AI team in other European
Oh, sure.
locations.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know the full logic
Well,
behind this.
I think if all the inference were being done in a centralized location, that could potentially be an issue. I think the other thing though about privacy, it is interesting you brought that up in terms of private data. In particular, you can now export information from Bard into Google Docs and into Gmail. You can also do some like copy paste, but I think the export, that might be something that's related to this. Would the actual export feature be the thing that holds them back from using this?
It's certainly possible, but it's interesting that that's a future feature that is in some ways separate from Bard. I mean, it's tied into it, but separate. So I'm not sure why they've decided to bind themselves to it this early, if that's the case.
Okay, so my hypothesis is pretty straightforward. They just don't want the headaches. And when people were talking about this in LinkedIn, because we had a post on this 20-point rundown on Bard, they were saying, well, geez, they talked about privacy protection, how important that was, but they're not actually walking the walk. They're just talking it. If they were really doing that, they'd be able to be available in Europe. And my response was that there's actually something just more basic here. This is, as they say, an experiment. And that's one of the 20 points here that we have. And they emphasize that several times. It's actually in the branding on the website. It says Bard experiment. And as an experiment, things might go wrong. They don't know exactly what's going to happen. And the other thing I would say is, first of all, when Google talks about safety and privacy, they really talk about safety more than anything else. A little bit about security, a little bit about privacy, because this idea of safety and the downstream implications of that would be significant. But when we think about rolling this out in Europe, and what we've already seen from ChatGPT is, do they really want the headline that's Google in French court today about privacy violations due to Bard, alongside the other headlines that are saying Google Bard not nearly as good as ChatGPT?
Right. I think it's just, kind of making sure that they're not getting themselves into hotter water than they're already in.
Yeah, that was my short answer was they just don't want the headache.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you look at ChatGPT as well, when you're doing this, even if you have all the best systems in place, one engineer updating one open source library could actually create an issue for you. This has happened time and again. You just look at the Verizon report on security vulnerabilities every year. It's like there's several examples of this. That's what happened with them. And once you have one of those, then the regulatory bodies will use that as a pretext to look at that, but they'll also expand it, which exactly what we saw in Italy. They're like, oh yeah, and we're going to look at these 5 other issues not related to the security vulnerability, but we're also concerned about these. And so, as many people know, that the action in Italy has been resolved mostly at this point. But that's something I think they just don't want. So first thing, we can sort of move on from that in terms of the not EU. They're going to be in the EU, but for now you can use a VPN. I already know people that have done that since yesterday.
It's clear they're going to be in the EU because, as they said, more languages are coming.
Exactly.
And many of those are EU languages. So presumably by the time they start rolling those languages out, they'll have addressed whatever issues there were.
Exactly. So it's just caution. If you're in the EU, I think it's a trade-off, right? You have stricter privacy regulations, which is great and probably the right answer for the countries in the EU. But that might mean that some innovations are going to come to market a little bit later. So yes, they do have 40 languages. Many of them are European languages that are coming up. Oh, also, Bard is not a search engine; it's a chatbot, and they really made this kind of clear implicitly. So it looks like ChatGPT, which is not a search engine, although it has a feel of search. And if you've used Bard, if you've used Bard and you've seen a source link, you're kind of a unicorn. I mean, I've used it quite a bit. I've seen one source link in all my interactions with it. So it doesn't really provide a search function. It's really more just like a summarization function of the data that it's hitting. But what we also saw in the search segment from IO, that a Bard-like conversational assistant is going to be in search. It looks like it operates a lot more like Bing Chat.
I feel like there are going to be a lot of people that will see this and fundamentally be confused about it. They're going to say, yeah, how are the two different from each other? And I think it's a legitimate question, but it's also one that I think, Microsoft is dealing with, when they're trying to differentiate between ChatGPT and Bing Chat. What's the difference between the two? Just in that case, it's more obvious. You got two different companies. In Google, it starts getting down to, well, okay, what's the difference between Google and Google? And that's a recurring theme when it comes to Google in general.
Absolutely. And we have a question here from Robert Kessig. Alan, in your view, which will be more powerful, Bard in the Google Work Suite or GPT in Office 365?
I think it's an interesting question. I'll admit I have a bias on this one. I've liked Google Workspace far more than I've ever liked Office 365, not least of which because of its amazing network capabilities. And I think some of those network capabilities are what's going to make it inside Workspace so much better. One of the things that is not on this list, and we'll probably get to it later, was Project Tailwind, which
Yes.
was just kind of brilliant to me, basically saying, hey, all of your docs, all of your spreadsheets, all of your slides, let's use those to be personally searchable to you and your corporation. That's an amazing, and use that to drive other documents or whatever you need with AI. That's incredibly powerful. That starts leveraging, that starts leveraging everything you've already done into the future, as opposed to saying, well, what can I do with this document? It's now saying, what can I do with everything I've ever done? That's big.
Yeah, and I want to, if I can, I'll try to bring that up, but we should just talk about that for a minute. Tailwind, super interesting. They showed it as if you're a student taking notes, and each class, you have a Google Doc for the notes for that class. You put them in a folder. You then have Tailwind, which you can assign to a Tailwind, I guess, product instance, something like that. All the different source files that you want for that. It's not clear to me that it's only Google Docs, because the way they were talking about it seemed like PDFs might be supported as well. But then once you have them, you can query it as if it's your own ChatGPT for all of your notes.
No, exactly. I mean, we see a lot of third parties talking about things like, take your company's documentation and put it into this database and query it using ChatGPT or ChatGPT like. But this is the first time we're seeing, this is Google saying, hey, you're already doing this. Poof, it's there. It's happened for you. And although they demonstrated it talking about students, they did kind of suggest that, it's more than just students who will be able to take advantage of this.
I'm sure like everybody on the product team was like, oh, I could use this today, right? They're like, there's so many, I just think about like all the data we have at VoiceBot, 5,000 articles, a lot of reports, all these other things. Could I do that and just like search that to find things, or make that available to people who are, VoiceBot readers or Synthetia readers? That would be amazing.
Right. Or if you picture a company with all of its internal documentation, and now suddenly you can just say, what is this policy? And it will say, here's what the policy is, and here are the documentation related to it.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think Tailwind was probably one of the most exciting things that was talked about for the entire 4 hours or whatever, 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
And it only got a couple of minutes.
Exactly. To me, that is the highlight. We haven't even Eric put something in the roundup around it, but like I haven't even got to that yet because Bard was sort of the number one story yesterday to talk about in Synthedia. But yes, that is one of the ones that I am most excited about because it's like practical application right
Yes,
away.
right.
Uh,
And as we've seen in the comments, other people are agreeing, and we've all signed up for the preview as soon as they open it up to us. So there's lots of people that are just waiting to see what it's actually going to be like.
All right, a few more things in here. They said there's improvements in math, logic, and reasoning. Trust us. Enhanced coding support. 20 languages now supported. Export to the Google IDE. That's useful. They've already talked about some of the coding support. This is different, by the way, from the Google AI Duet solution. It's like, oh my gosh, Duet has two different functions, but this is one of them, and it's basically GitHub Copilot or Code Whisperer version for that. But Bard also, just like ChatGPT, has got some coding skills. It's supposedly going to be available in Google Workspace as of, actually, if you look at the announcements, it should have been available on the 5th of May, or excuse me, if you go into like the release notes, but it's not there yet. We talked about export to Sheets. Oh, it does tables really nicely. I was actually impressed with that. They showed it in the demonstration at I/O, and I went into Bard and I was like, oh, I can create some tables, and it does. It copies really nicely into Google Sheets. If you just do the copy function, it also works really well with Excel, which I thought was cool.
Well, I think that the big deal here isn't just that you can copy and paste something in. It's also that you've basically got 2 clicks and it creates a Google Sheet out of it. Or, for other things, it's 2 clicks and it turns it into a Gmail. So it's that kind of integration that between, across Google's products that I think is kind of neat, and something that I don't think I've heard of with Microsoft, which
It's not.
surprises me a
Yeah,
little bit.
this does not exist in Microsoft yet. They've talked about, actually, this is an interesting point because Microsoft's talked about the bigger picture items, or the more visionary items, like take my notes and turn it into a client proposal, or turn these, these Google Docs into a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, that stuff's all great. This is what we just talked about here, whether it's Tailwind or just export, things like that. Very practical. Like these are things you would use every day.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what, in a lot of cases, when we talk about AI, we kind of lose those kinds of pictures about, we see these grand visions of things that we can do. But what's real is, how do I use this on a day-to-day basis? Not how do I use this once in a while, but what does this turn into every single day? That's where we're going to see the power to it. In the same way that we saw, autocomplete sentences in Gmail was an example they gave of where this technology had been used in the past. They're just kicking it up a few notches.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, they do this like, you need to give us credit for what we've already done.
Yes.
Are we really behind? No, we've been leading this market.
No, that was very funny watching them say, no, honest, we've been doing this all along. You just, you didn't realize that this was AI.
Yeah, we didn't make it a big enough. We didn't, like, you just saw it like autocomplete. You didn't realize that this is generative. All right, so they're going to have images. This doesn't exist yet. I tried this many times. They're going to, and here's the thing. So you're going to be able to do automated, not just image search and like response to like your queries to have images that are already on the web. You're going to be able to generate new images from within Bard, but they're using Adobe Firefly and not Imagine. What? Why is that?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One is that Imagine is still, being worked on, while Firefly is out there. And second,
no, but they announced Imagine's available now through Google Cloud, right?
Well, it's
the Vertex models.
Yeah, but it's not publicly available. It's available on a limited basis right now.
Yeah. Okay, fair
enough. Whereas Firefly has been out there, and people trust Firefly. Google knows sometimes to say, look, here's what you're using right now. We're going to support that, and then we're going to support this other thing, going forward as well. And I think the way they're doing it, though, is interesting and important. Is it's the equivalent of plugins. It's
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And they were listed in the well, the extensions, it's like
yeah.
their terminology. Yeah, so they're going to have integration with Maps and other Google services. This is one of the reasons why it would be very good, because Google has so many amazing services that everyone uses every day, and so if you can integrate it, that's good. None of those things actually work yet in Bard, but that's okay. You do have the export to Google Docs into Gmail, and you can do a copy and paste into Sheets right now. So, like, that stuff does work, which I give them kudos for. That's really useful. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly was the models. So, I kind of feel like LaMDA is the Voldemort of LLMs inside of Google right now. It's like they didn't mention LaMDA once. LaMDA was mentioned in February. It was mentioned last year. All they said, and they said it many times, now on Palm 2.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I'm not sure how many people are actually going to care all that much, because right now some of these names are starting to turn into this huge blur. You know, what is Palm? Why do I care? What was Lambda besides a terrible name to begin with? So I think people are mostly kind of eyes are glazing over with that, but they're just trying to drive home the point that they've been making it better and better and better. And oh yes, if you tried it before, it's better now. And oh yeah, it's going to be better in the future too.
And that's the whole point. I think it was really interesting. So, what does OpenAI do? GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT 3.5, GPT-4. What does Google do? LaMDA, Palm, Gemini. And basically they're telling you, or they're trying to signal to you, that these are completely different models. GPT-3, GPT-4, are they completely different models? Yeah, I mean, like, bigger data set. I mean, they put new learnings into it, but they're signaling that, oh, if you had a bad experience a couple months ago on LaMDA, don't worry, we have Palm now, and Palm's amazing. And oh, by the way, and this is the foreshadowing with Gemini, it's amazing. And like, we saw nothing from it. We just heard Sundar saying how amazing it is. If you don't like Palm, just wait until what we have for you later this year.
I think the thing that kind of gets me, that I'm still trying to figure out, is what is their meaning behind some of these names? Because one of the things that Sundar showed was he showed a slide talking about Palm and how there were different flavors of Palm. That some of them
Yeah.
were very small, could work on small devices and so forth, and some were very large. And those had names, but they had a picture that was associated with each one that kind of looked like a constellation. And now here they're talking about Gemini, a constellation. I'm like, do we have a new theme going on here?
Well, yeah.
What's the meaning of these constellations here?
Who knows? Who knows who does branding over there? I think Palm Pathways language model. It's like, it's a more technical description. LaMDA also, was a technical description of of a language model for chat. So they're moving to more of these branded model names, which I think is a smart move. I just what I thought was really interesting was, saying, basically trying to preempt some of the criticism in two ways. One is, if you don't like it now, we've got a better one coming. It's going to be amazing. Just trust us, and which is fine. I think that's like legitimate. But the other thing too is, I think they were cognizant of the fact that if they introduced the Gemini model in September, let's say, and they talked about Palm today, everyone would say, oh, they had to change models because that old stuff was garbage. I wonder if this new stuff is just slightly better than garbage, or not good enough. And so they're saying, like, right now, they're saying, oh, by the way, we have Gemini. It's coming up. And so when it comes out, it'll just be like, oh, yeah, of course, they already planned to do this. It's not like they're reacting to not being good enough.
Right. This is them clearly saying, we're building ahead for the future. And that's in some ways contrasting to OpenAI, which has said, yeah, we've got GPT-4. Maybe there won't be a GPT-5.
Well, I think if you hear Sam Altman talk, there might be a GPT-10 in the works. But yeah, GPT-5 actually, my understanding is actually ready for testing this summer. But along those lines too, you mentioned extensions really briefly, and it only deserves a brief mention because I guess a couple of things. Extensions, ChatGPT plugins, which we talked about a lot last week. I've done a bunch of videos on it because I have access to the plugins model. It's like underwhelming, I'd have to say, in terms of what it is. But like, everybody's got the same idea about that when we get from the knowing to the doing, right? Large language models are good about knowing information, things like that. They're not good at the doing execution, and they don't have access to all the doing because of the different services and things like that. They're going to use third parties, and they're going to have just a way that's like, it's not an app, it's an extension because it's integrated into the regular experience supposedly. Although the way OpenAI implements it, it's more like an app. In any event, they're going to have it, and it's half the extensions listed are identical to the plugins that are already available in ChatGPT.
I think the biggest difference between the two, from my perspective so far, and this is as a developer, is that OpenAI released the specification for developers, even though you can't build, you can't do anything with it yet. Whereas Google has just said, we've got these extensions, and the audience applauded without having any idea what an extension
without
was.
seeing them.
Without seeing them, without knowing what they were, and they have not published anything, at least not publicly that I've been able to find, anything about what that API looks like.
So Robert's got this question. Right now, prompts are the key to unlocking the power of Bard GPT. I sort of agree with that, but we'll sort of keep going. Could the next generation of these LLM models start self-improving by coming up with the perfect prompt to ask themselves based on the context? It's not exactly how it's working. And the models need to be able to interpret better. I think that when we talk about prompts, it's an open question about how accessible prompt engineering quality, prompt engineering knowledge is going to be. But the first thing that I think everyone's trying to do is, based on whatever prompt you put in, try to optimize the response. And then the second thing would be, when we move into things like plugins, they're basically enhancing the prompts to take advantage of the APIs that are available and what's now the very limited functionality that those APIs offer, which I think will be more robust in the future. So that's where the prompt is going to do, is in terms of these handoffs. It's almost like orchestration, that there will be prompt enhancements which will be associated with specific third parties, maybe the base model, but I'm not anticipating that anytime soon.
I think we are going to see experiments along the lines of what Robert's talking about, with things like Auto GPT, for example, which executes a prompt and takes the results and kind of uses that to refine the prompts over multiple stages, or chain prompts, so that the results of one prompt is fed into the next prompt, which refines the question a little bit better. I'm wondering how much we're going to see that front-ended directly by the systems themselves, partly because it takes time and energy, and I'm not sure we want to dedicate to that. Yeah,
they've got too many fish to fry. I mean, I think I was just talking to someone a few minutes ago about personalization, and I think that personalization is going to come slowly to these platforms because they have so many other things that they have to do first. And what we've seen historically, if we think about these as like chatbots or voice assistants, they never get to personalization because they already have so many things that they have to do just on a base level to make everybody's experience better. That could be a really big differentiation. We talked a couple of weeks ago about ADOT on this on the Gain show. That's out of SK Telecom. That is highly personalized, but the idea there is it's a companion as opposed to some sort of assistant-like feature, chatbot feature. So it just happens to be a companion that uses those tools. That's where we're going to probably see this emerge first.
Yeah, I think the other issue with personalization is that in a lot of ways that translates to loading more data into the prompt about the person or about the context, and that just makes the prompt larger, possibly hitting its maximum, and it makes it slower because that's how this generation works.
Yeah.
So unless there's a radical change in how they work, I don't see too much personalization getting loaded into it.
Yeah, I think eventually it's sort of obvious it'll come, but yeah, it's not in the near term. There's so many other things, and they've got so many things that they have to do. These are not these are not production grade products yet. I mean, maybe some of them like Jasper and some of the ones that are second tier are basically applications. But let's hit on, we've dominated Google this time, but let's hit on a couple more things. We'll get to some other topics as well, because I know some people here are going to be interested in that. So Palm 2, we talked about Bard, Vertex AI, making available the 3 foundation models. I think limited preview. It's sort of what we've been seeing every 3 or 4 weeks from Google saying, this is coming. If you're a trusted tester, you know who you are, you'll get access.
Well, so here's the thing. Those 3 new foundation models are available to anybody that wants to use Vertex AI. And I think that's a kind of big step in a lot of ways, is saying, this is the equivalent of OpenAI's API for GPT-4. So this is Google saying, hey, on a production server, because we're Google Cloud, we do production server things. You've now got the ability to do these sorts of things. One of the things that didn't get mentioned, I thought, which it baffles me about how Google deals with this sometimes, is they talk about embedding models a lot, and everyone always talks about these embedding models, and without any explanation on why you would want an embedding model. And these embedding models are used to take your documents and create large vectors that you put into a vector database. So a lot of places where you're seeing, like, do GPT-like queries over your data, what they've done is they're basically taking your data, turned it into embeddings using OpenAI, put it into a vector database, and let you query against it. The problem is, there are companies that offer embeddings and there are companies that offer the vector database, but there's nobody that offers both of them at the same time, except for Google, who has offered a vector database for about 2 years now, which nobody seems to remember, including apparently Google.
Yeah, because they didn't mention
this. But one of the offerings that's part of Vertex AI is a vector database.
Yes.
So I can easily see in the near future, and in fact, I went and looked at some of the things from that Firebase is now offering. And they're offering tighter integration with that vector database and tighter integration to embeddings. So Firebase is starting to offer those.
Well, there are third parties who are doing these things. Like you think of like Got It AI with Elmar and things like that. One of their models is that. But you're right. The big players. When you have a foundation model that's supposed to be a general foundation model, we've seen this like in the voice assistant space. There's a lot to do to make that work because your scope, your domains are so broad, and it's only logical that some people would come in and provide sort of these specialized models, smaller, faster, more targeted, and use your foundation model just to make sure the pros coming out of it. Sounds good.
Yeah, but when you're claiming you've got these other already esoteric in some ways models to use, why not go the full route? We saw that Amazon announced similarly an embeddings model, and yet AWS doesn't have a vector database.
Okay, so good points. All right, so the other thing we'll just do actually 2 more quick things on Google because it's just so fun. So maybe just an aside, they did announce Wendy's is using Google Generative AI for drive-throughs. I thought this was really interesting because like drive-throughs are like really a hot market for any type of conversational assistant today, in large part because restaurants just they can't staff up properly. They can't hire the people that, who left during COVID and things like that. And so I thought that was very interesting given that there's so much activity there and that, Google is, is viewed as not just a this generalist tool to sort of build on what you're talking about, that people can use it for these specialty items as well.
And I think this is kind of, what we're going to see more and more as people start looking at the tools that Microsoft Azure is offering and that Google Cloud are offering, is saying, hey, we've got all these components. How do we put the components together to do things that are better for us? Not just how can I, deliver your order as a limerick, but how can I actually take your order and process it into a structured form that makes sense to me? I particularly like the Wendy's one because one of the things that I use to test out ChatGPT and Bard and so forth is trying to, tell it to pretend that it is a fast food restaurant taking my order. And how well does it do it? And can it deliver it to me in in a format that I can then feed to an API. So it was really pleasing to me to hear that somebody followed
Somebody's
through
using
on
it.
that. Somebody's actually doing that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's good. And Michael Novak, brought up this idea of personalization versus domain personalization or domain specialization. And I think that's an important point as we think about these models going forward. And Wendy's is a good example. Like basically, they're taking a domain personalization into the model. There's going to be user personalization on the other side of it. Maybe not at Wendy's, but some other places. Maybe eventually. Who knows? Okay, so I did want to talk about this other thing. One of the more popular posts that I put in Synthedia. If you guys don't sign up for Synthedia, by the way, or if you haven't, it's just go to bit.ly/Synthedia. It's a daily generative AI newsletter. We break down news, data, concepts, but a lot of thought pieces. And this was a thought piece on a thought piece, kind of. So supposedly, an engineer researcher inside of Google put a memo out basically saying, Google has no moat and neither does OpenAI. And you guys are missing the boat internally. It's a big issue. And a key part of the thesis was that Google doesn't understand or fails to acknowledge that the quality gap has really shrunk. And they have this little chart in here that shows like how fast some of these smaller models are comparing to Bard and GPT. After like a 2-week, optimization cycle, someone comes out with a new model based on the learnings from the previous small model, and that's going to be a big benefit. And then from an open source standpoint, that open source is going to win the day. And the example that they provide is that in the image space, Stable Diffusion has largely won the day in that space. It's not that Midjourney is not super popular and has a good user base. It's not that DALL-E is not used. It's just that so many companies just said, oh, I can just take Stability AI API to Stable Diffusion, or I can deploy my own Stable Diffusion instance for free. Basically, I just have to maintain it. And that, ultimately large language models are going to go the same way. I think you've looked at this. I mean, what are your thoughts on Google has no moat and what the implication is if that's true for all the others, or do you agree with the thesis?
Well, I agree with the point to a great extent. This is some of these open models are really powerful and doing really well. I think, I guess the way I would think about it is, well, okay, if I was a Google executive, how would I actually react to that sort of thing? And if I was a Google Cloud executive, I would be cheering at this news. Because one of the things that Google Cloud is fantastically good at is taking open source products and turning them into a commercial product from Google and having people pay a ton of money to run an open source product on their server. So I can easily imagine Google Cloud would be cheering this news so that easily in the future, one of the things that they've just released is this AI model garden, for example, in cloud. Okay, could this model garden include models from open sources, from other parties? I think it easily could. There's nothing saying these have to be just Google models. And once you have the model there, how do you now launch this model on Google Cloud? How do you access this using Google Cloud and, therefore pay Google to use an open source model?
Yes.
From Google's perspective, it's brilliant.
Well, and AWS does this as well, right? I mean, it's like although interestingly, when AWS came out with Bedrock, it was all proprietary models. Well, no, actually, I mean, you could think of it like they have Stability AI's Stable Diffusion, but Stability AI's is like the proprietary packaging of the open source model that they created. So yeah, I could see that. I haven't seen an example yet of where an open source LLM has been put into production, as a product. So when that happens, like I'll go down that path with them. I'm not sure that the analogy with images and LLMs is the same. I'm not sure. I definitely don't agree with the idea that this is the only type of moat that you can have, which is basically a technology or a network effect moat. Those are the two things that they were talking about. No, there's like OpenAI has 100 million monthly active users on ChatGPT. They also have certainly tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of users who are using their APIs. And so they already have their own network effects, associated with that. So, and also what you find is that in most of these markets, even the ones where open source does really well, there's some sort of proprietary alternative. So there's going to be proprietary. I think open source is going to do very well in this space. It's going to take a little while because it's another layer of uncertainty. We already have the uncertainty layer of like, this is a new space. We don't know how these things work. There's a big transition going on. And so people have to work through that. This other layer of uncertainty, and I'm going to roll my own with this open source. I'm going to maintain it, as opposed to, at least I can reduce one of those variables by putting that responsibility on somebody else.
Well, and I think that's the big thing, is that, a lot of traditional developers, the huge, vast number of developers out there, are going to say, oh, it's an AI model. What do I do with it? Do I, what's the API for it? What's the library for it? How do I, include
How do I
this
optimize inference to reduce cost, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that are going on.
Right. So, there's going to be a lot of people saying, I don't know what to do with it, but hey, Microsoft and Google and AWS are offering this simple API. I know what an API is. I'm just going to use that.
I think that's how it's all going to get started. And once it gets started that way, once you're already using the OpenAI API to run a feature in MailChimp, are you going to switch off to an open source solution? Yes, you might, but it's a much bigger step at that point to say, oh, I've got something working, I've got to switch out. So then you're in a transition period, and it's going to be a little different. So in any event, I thought it was a fascinating memo. The thesis that's laid out is an important thesis for the market to think about. But I just thought we would spend a couple minutes talking about it here. And Dave Garbino did actually just say, that Meta open sourcing their AI model was really interesting. There is this other thing here where, because Meta is not trying to commercialize the language model itself, but potentially use it in some of their products. It's not really clear what their long-term goal is. They're a little fuzzy on that. But the fact that they're open sourcing this to the research community and then it spills out, if everybody starts using Meta's models, that'll be really fascinating, because as the original creator of that model, even though it's out there in the wild, you'll have undue influence on how that progresses. And it could be the wedge that Meta uses to become highly relevant in this space.
And I think that's a significant point. We've seen lots of open source products that are open source projects, and yet they originated at Facebook. React, for example, incredibly popular web development library that started at Facebook, is still largely driven by Facebook. And yet there's a massive community around it. It's what almost everybody uses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Costas brings up a good thing about the cost of training the large models is so much bigger than the small models, and that this is part of the thesis. Yeah, that's true. I don't think there's quality parity, and the quality parity, the difference between 82% and 87% can be a very big difference to an enterprise buyer in particular, or anybody who's offering something. And the ability to go up to 95% also very big. I think that the inference costs are actually the bigger issue as opposed to the training costs, because we've got some new strategies around retraining that is filling in some of the gaps. But I think that's like it's a very legitimate consideration in terms of the lower cost going forward. Okay, so I think we should move on to some other news today. Fun talking about Google. Hope everybody really liked that.
I got to tell you, Brett, I'm surprised you didn't want to bring up the big AI news that was talked about in I/O, and that's how on the new Android, you're going to be able to use generative AI to generate your backgrounds. Yeah. I mean, that they spent a whole 15 minutes on that.
And I liked it. I mean, I liked that they were showing something in production, like they were actually doing a live demo. That stuff's cool. But yes, I mean, that sort of goes to show how mature the smartphone market is. It's just like, I can do my own personalized background. Isn't that cool? But when you don't have a lot to show in the other spaces, like snippets, I mean, the segment on BART extensions, I think was like 40 seconds or something like that. It was like, there was nothing there. So, so a really good point. Actually, I thought the thing you were going to bring up is that, oh, by the way, the Nest Hubs, you can expect those to go away because now a Android tablet will fit on a base that looks exactly like a Nest Hub base. And oh, by the way, the number one feature is you can access your Android apps from it. Has all the other features of your smart display. And oh, by the way, your smart display doesn't have Google Actions anymore in 1 month.
Yeah, at only 3 times the price.
Oh, I know. Well, yeah. But nothing's as expensive as that foldable.
Oh, good grief!
Well, you get a free watch. You get a free Pixel watch.
Well, it's good you get a free something out of that because I'll admit the foldable form factor is not a form factor I understand. I will readily admit that. So for those that like it and want it, that's fantastic for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, the fact that they're trying to redefine what audio on a desktop sounds like, disappoints me. I was hoping to hear more about what their plans were for smart speakers and smart displays besides we've got the tablet. And I'm disappointed we didn't see that.
Yeah. Well, and Eric Schwartz from Voice.ai did a story this week because we looked at the IO things and we looked at 2 years ago, so 21, which wasn't like the biggest year for Google Assistant. I think there were 13 or 14 sessions specifically to Google Assistant. Last year there were 4. This year, I think there's 3 that
officially there are 3.
Yeah, yeah. But they've got other things in. 2 of those have other things in it as well, right? As I recall, but I don't know.
I mean, basically they're tying the assistant directly to Pixel Watch stuff. To Android Auto, to cross-platform Android development now, which is understandable. But when, at I/O, the big talk about Android were large screens and not audio, I think that's a hint.
Oh, yeah. Well, we talked about this in 2019 based on the presentation, particularly it was the developer keynote. And we're like, wow, they're not talking about Google Assistant. It's all about Android and Assistant supporting Android. And we're like, oh, I think that's a signal. Plus, that was about the same time that they reorganized and Google Assistant went under Android. And we're like, okay, well, the tail's not going to wag the dog. Okay. So anyway, let's move on because that's a long time ago now. So a couple other things that happened this week. We'll do rapid fire as we wrap this up and talk about some things. Bing Chat is now available for everybody to use. So Bard and Bing Chat is, in my estimation, is superior to Bard. I've got a bunch of things in here in the Synthesia article. I think that it is quite a bit different than ChatGPT because you do have real time access to the internet. You do have citations that it gives you. It's free. And actually, I haven't even talked about this yet. So first of all, I think I wrote maybe in a LinkedIn post a couple of weeks ago that there's now visuals that show up sometimes. Yesterday or the day before, I noticed that now it's giving me news snippets. Like if I ask a question, it'll give me the generated response plus the links. Plus it'll say, hey, here's some recent news on these things and give me 5 things to click through. So, they're working on it. The key downside of it is you still have to use the Edge browser. But I actually think the Edge browser, I wouldn't have tried it if I didn't have to get into Bing a couple months ago, but I think it's actually pretty good. So that's not a huge issue. I think if people try it, they won't have a problem, but it's just habit switching. And it still does have hallucinations. Someone in the chat mentioned that that's sort of an issue, but I don't find it has many hallucinations. Actually, it's pretty rare that I've noticed that there was something wrong. In any event, I don't think you've tried it, but to me, having used ChatGPT a lot, having used Bard, having trialed some of the others in the space as well, I think it's really good. And it's basically a slightly different alignment or use case tuned version of ChatGPT. So it has all the benefits of search, but it'll do all the other things too. It'll write you a poem in the style of Dr. Seuss if you want.
I think it's going to be interesting to see just how that slight shift in tone does make a difference in how people use one versus the other. And at the same time, I'm also going to be interested in seeing how the conversational search that's coming from Google as part of their labs, what exactly that implication is and how that's going to compare to Bing Chat.
Well, if you look at the UI that they demonstrated yesterday, it's basically they replicated what's going on in Bing right now.
Yeah, Do I look surprised? No.
Well, why not? I mean, like it works for Facebook, just
Yeah.
copy, right? So I don't even think it's actually that great of a UI. I wish they would change it, but that's okay. At some point, we'll all basically Google's so heavily used. The moment that they turn that on, that is going to be 10x the amount of usage of what Bing has. So,
Well,
so it's going to be significant, and it will determine our UI going forward because that's what people will become familiar with.
and this was something that I read, and I don't remember where I read it today, as part of me trying to review what happened yesterday, was that it sounds like Microsoft was expecting this to actually bring a lot of people into Bing, and that hasn't happened yet. They haven't really pulled a lot of people away from Google, which is, I mean, I think in some ways it's disappointing
Well, no,
because I like healthy competition.
they talked about that in their analyst call shortly after they announced Bing Chat, and they were talking about the value of 2 points in market share. So they're in single digits in market share and search. 2 points of market. I think it's every point of market share is 2 billion, or maybe it's every 2 point. Yeah, I think it's every point of market share is worth $2 billion in revenue. And so you can just figure out what the margins are on that from an advertising standpoint, which are very hefty. And so it's a win for them, even if it doesn't go very, very much. If they get a couple points increase in Edge browser, also good for them. It's hard for me to see them taking over unless Google really dithers. One of the big problems with this Bing Chat, they can't actually implement it in the Chrome browser yet. If they were able to do that, they would have, I think, a lot more activity.
Yeah, perhaps. I think that it's a good point that Edge is still considered an inferior browser, even though there's really not that much of a difference between the two.
Well, I think they're different, but but I think Edge is good. I mean, I think it's good, and I like it better than what Firefox has right now. I like it better than what Safari's doing and what Brave is doing. Like I try all the different browsers at different times, but so that's one thing. Also, just by the way, if you're using Bing Chat, the generation is slow. I mean, this is like, and it's okay. Like everyone thinks search is like fast. I have a feeling that Bing, because they're using GPT-4, it's like a little too slow, but people will wait longer for a good answer than just show me links and like force me to like do all my own work for me. Maggie saying Bing is still a thing. Yeah, I mean it's not a big thing, but it's a thing. And with Bing Chat, because that is ChatGPT optimized for search, like it's certainly a thing. All right, so we have that. Oh, let's talk about some other fun things.
Oh, okay. I have a feeling I know what this one's going to be.
Oh, I don't know what just happened. I lost my thing. But we're going to talk about the White House meets with generative AI leaders about responsible innovation. What were your thoughts on that? Did you look at it?
I looked at it. I listened to a little bit about what was talked. I read some of the press releases. I did not read things in great detail. I think my biggest concern here, on one hand, it's great. They went and talked to the corporate heads of some of the leading corporate AI tools. But at the same time, there have been people who have been talking about, I won't say perils of AI, but raising concerns about AI for several years. The stochastic parrots paper, for example, 2 years ago, highlighted several serious concerns with the models that were coming online. And these were by AI researchers. These were, not people who were saying 100 years in the future, humanity is doomed because of what we're doing. They were saying right here, right now, there are concerns about these models. And I feel like the White House, the inspiration behind the White House meeting and what's come out of it have said, we need to make sure that, we don't doom humanity in the future, but very little looking at some of the issues that the stochastic parents paper brought up. And I feel like, some of those issues and questions and needs really do need to be addressed. So I think this is a missed opportunity by the White House to highlight the full range of issues that are out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just had someone, like, I recorded an episode for the podcast, which won't be out for 2 or 3 weeks, but this is a lawyer in, living in the EU that's worked on some of the AI laws in several countries. And his view is that, in part, that, like, a lot of people are sort of rushing to regulate, rushing to do laws, and that we actually have some common ground around principles, and that we should just make sure that everybody sort of generally agrees on the principles before we start regulating. But I think you bring up this other point. We got into something related to this in our conversation. And this is, what are the problems and what's like an acceptable level of risk? So when we think about principles, usually it's like, we don't want this to happen. We don't want this to happen. We don't want this to happen. This group to be excluded, or these problems to show up in privacy. Sure. I think there's some other principles about what we would like to have out of it. We want people to have access to these tools, so it does level the playing field for people who might not have as much as experience or or training as you and I have. Like, they can sort of up level a little bit and sort of close that gap a little bit. But I think you bring up this other idea too, is that what are the problems we want to address, and what does addressing them look like? And that can be a spectrum depending on the country, the culture, what your values are about how you do it. But just have an idea of like what that spectrum looks like.
Well, also, addressing things like, well, what are the implications? What is the implication of the fact that Mid-Journey has trained its model on tons and tons of images without really looking at what the copyright was? What are the implications of hiring thousands of people to classify data sources at low wages? These are some immediate questions in some ways that people don't really think about a lot of when we're trying to reach these bigger objectives.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you. I think that this is an interesting idea that you're saying it's a missed opportunity. I thought it was sort of they're punting a little bit. They're saying, hey, we're just going to wait a little bit. And they want to get credit for like announcing, I think it was 7 new AI institutes that the federal government's going to fund, to sort of be behind it. And I think there's these competing themes going on in the market of ideas in this case, around this idea of, okay, what can it do? Safety, robot overlords, bias. There's a whole spectrum of those things that bring up, and like everyone's against AI in one of those. And so does that make you against AI? But then there's this countervailing force saying, oh, wait a second, if we just stop doing this, or we're too restrictive, are we going to get outcompeted at the nation state level because someone else is going to use it? Maybe they're going to use it in a way that steals our economic advantage, is used in, as a weapon of war. I don't know. So I think it's so complex. I thought it was really interesting that the White House, which I thought was actually going to go along the lines of what you're talking about, the problems, they actually just said, hey, yeah, we're going to look at this.
No, and that later point of yours, where's the international competitive advantage? As we see Google and other companies having issues in Europe, there are a lot of people saying, well, look, see, this is why the European regulations are bad, is because they're going to put us at a disadvantage when it comes to AI. As opposed to saying, well, maybe this is a slightly cautious but wise move. But asking what those trade-offs are. I think we need to discuss what the trade-offs are before we make huge policy decisions, whatever direction.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's the conversation is not being had. Like there's a group of people that's shouting we should do something, and there's a bunch of other people saying quietly maybe not, and like there's no middle ground there.
No, and I think so. So in that sense, I think this meeting at the White House was good as a start of a conversation, but it is not the end of the conversation. It needs to be the conversation needs to be ongoing. And I don't think it is really a conversation that's ongoing. As you're saying, it's people shouting from both ends right now.
Well, in a very small group, because most people don't care that much, right? And I think that, Margie's point here is a really good one. Most people don't understand AI, how it's integrated into our life today. Like, you're not wrong, you're right. So there's an education process to say, okay, well, if AI goes away, here are some things you might not have. If AI goes too far, here are some things that might be nefarious to your, viewed as negative to you. We were gonna talk about deepfakes, but we've really run a little bit long. I did want to talk about one additional thing while you're here, though. So maybe there's a couple of things around deepfakes. There's actually some really interesting things going on in that space, but we'll do that next week because we're here every week and we have that option. So
deepfakes are interesting, but that one starts blowing my mind when I think about it too hard.
Yeah, so that's good. We'll have Eric here. Maybe I think I have another prominent guest next week who will love to talk about that. In any event, we have this story that this is up in VoiceBot's YouTube channel. It's in Synthedia. But Lee Malin, a lot of people will know him from the conversational AI industry, has been doing a lot of work with generative AI. And he recreated a TripAdvisor-like site with $53 and did it in just 15 hours. And to give you a sense of some of the stats here, essentially it's TripAdvisor for families, for like kid-friendly activities in 237 cities. That just happens to be the capital cities or capital-like cities that he identified around the world. And so he used ChatGPT to identify 10 activities in each of those cities. Used DALL-E to auto-generate 2,600 images to go along with those activities. He did some reviews. It's almost 250,000 words that were generated. He said he did not proofread them all, so who knows? And then he deployed it as a website, and it took him, he said, 15 hours. So call it 2 days. Very inexpensive. The token costs weren't that high to do this. It's a rudimentary website, and you guys can all look at it. If you go to Synthedia or you go to the VoiceBot YouTube channel, you'll be able to see it. But it really does call into question, well, could I recreate something like TripAdvisor or a niche version of that in just a couple of weeks? So I spend 2 days getting all the content together. I spend another week working on layout. I spend 2 more weeks on SEO. And then all of a sudden, I'm competitive in the Web 2 model of, giant website with lots of information that drives traffic, and I can put ads against it.
I know Lee pretty well. He and I have talked on a number of occasions, and that's always been, his conversations have always been interesting. When he started talking with me about, here's some of the travel things that he's been playing with, and we would try some of them out in ChatGPT, it was always fun to see what some of the results were. Some of them amazingly accurate, others amazingly inaccurate. So it was fun to see how that had been evolving over, the concept had been evolving over the past few weeks until he finally just, pulled the trigger and tried this. So it's been interesting. I think the bigger question you ask is, if anybody can do this for $53, what happens then? And I think that's where you're going to start getting into the, if you're going to have 1,000 travel sites out there, how does any of them rise over any other? How do you get the attention? And so this is a solution that will only, that now only benefits the advertising group, i.e. Google. So I don't see how the long-term play on this actually benefits too many people in general. But it's a great question. If you've got that niche site that you think nobody else is doing, and it lowers that cost of entry.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, he said that it took him 15 hours because he had to figure out basically the pipeline that he had to set up to do it. And he had to wait for image generations and some things. He said he could recreate this in a few hours. He could do it certainly within less than a day. And if you had someone else who had already had like the website set up, it would be, then it's even faster because that was part of the pipeline he had to develop. And also a bunch of people asked him to do this after he posted his blog. But if we look at a company like BuzzFeed is doing something kind of like this. What they did is they basically are using ChatGPT like LLM to generate trip ideas. And what they would do is they went around to their non-writers and they said, what would you like to have, or something like that. They created prompts out of that. And then they created hundreds of travel related pages based on this. And it says like, it's a little disclaimer at the top, like AI partially generated or something like that. but people are already doing this. I would bet that all of the big travel sites, all the big sites that like live on content are already doing something of this version. Lee just showed how easy it is. You could like even to get started because, these tools are really powerful.
Yeah. I think that's what's great is that, it's even for non-developers, the tools can be really powerful. I mean, you can use it to build static web pages. If you know how to use an editor of any sort, you can now create these web pages just by cutting and pasting. Or, hey, with the new, Bard, you're just going to be able to send it directly to a Google Doc that you can now publish. So there's lots of ways that anybody will be able to get into and get started with it. The question then is, okay, how do you differentiate yourself from every other synthetically generated site?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the point here is that today it takes a lot of manpower, person power, we'll say, to generate all that content, because number of pages does matter, and like in variance in those pages and URLs. If you could redirect some of that time and effort from creating to differentiation to SEO strategies, those types of things, maybe that's just a more effective economic model.
Maybe, but at the same time, what are you going to be differentiating on? It can no longer be your content, because your content is this utterly generic description.
Well, maybe not. Like, it sort of depends. Depends how good your prompt is. It might
But
not
even responses to even clever response. Okay, so fine, I'm going to have the Pirate's Guide to Travel.
That's a great idea.
And everything is
that.
And everything is going to be, well, you lubber, if you wanted to sail the seven seas, there's no better place to go than England, I tell you. So after you get a dozen of those.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, let's wrap this up. This is very, very fun. Allen Firstenberg, where can people keep track of what you're doing? Maybe go to your office hours.
I have office hours every Wednesday where I chat about what's going on in voice. You can find me on Twitter at @Firstenberg. And I have a podcast that I do with my friend Mark Tucker, where we originally talked about voice. We are the two voice devs. And more we're talking about how generative AI fits into that space.
Perfect. All right, folks, I'm Brett Kinsella. I'm the founder of VoiceBot.ai and Synthedia, also the host most weeks. Sometimes Eric sits in for me, but host most weeks of GAIN, Generative AI News Rundown. We're here at 12 noon Eastern Time every Thursday on LinkedIn and YouTube. Thanks so much for everybody who attended today and gave us comments, like Paul's right at the end there. That was great. I love that affirmation at the end. Thanks, Paul. These have been really fun. There was so much happening in generative AI. We found that this was just like a simple way to sort of get a little bit more nuance around this, run down, create a new way for people to keep track of what's going on. This is also, you'll be able to watch the video if you joined late. Afterwards, you can watch the video on VoiceBot's YouTube channel. So youtube.com/VoiceBot.ai. Where else? You can see this in Synthedia. We usually do like a weekly roundup, which includes this. And that's it. VoiceBot podcast. We also have been publishing this VoiceBot podcast. So if you want to listen to that. So like it shows up a lot of different places, but that's just because there's so much going on. This has been fun to have people like Allen in, get that new perspective on what's happening and stay track of what's going on. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us on YouTube. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn. Come back next week. So fun to have the comments to like drive the conversation. And thank you, Allen.
Thanks for having me, Brett.
All right, everyone. Bye-bye.